Welcome to another emission of Globedades. This is a podcast from the Faculty of Global Studies at Universidad Anáhuac, Mexico. My name is Arturo Flores, and today we have a very special guest. We have got Dr. Kiernan McClelland. Did I get that right?
You did.
Who is from Canada, and I'm going to tell you a bit of his background. He did a BA in political science at Carleton University, and then a master's degree in strategic studies at the University of Calgary, and lastly, a PhD in political science at Carleton University in Ottawa. His working experience includes being a policy analyst on strategic and space utilization policy for the Canadian Space Agency. And recently, he joined also our research center in international affairs, something which we are very proud of, having him as one of our colleagues in this research center that we have here at Anáhuac University. Welcome, Kiernan. Today we're going to talk about the Canadian election, which is happening very, very soon. Welcome, Kiernan.
Yes. Thank you, Antonio, for having me. It's a pleasure.
Great. So we are wondering, first of all, how does the Canadian electoral system operate? Could you tell us, provide an overall view about the electoral system in Canada?
Absolutely, and really to kind of get to the kind of main points of the question, we really need to understand what even is the Canadian parliamentary system, because a lot that we will do on our election day stems from our parliamentary tradition. So just to sort of reiterate, Canada is a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary democracy stemming from a British Westminster tradition. Now, what do I mean by a constitutional monarchy? Well, Canada does have a constitution. In fact, we've had two constitutions. The British North American Act, which essentially federated Canada as its own independent British colony, and the 1982 Canadian Constitution, which includes a number of our foundational legal documents, including the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. However, within these articles of legislation and law, it is prescribed that the executive authority in Canada is the Crown, the sovereign, the British monarchy in this case, as represented in Canada by his Governor General. And we are a parliamentary democracy. And again, of course, on the other side, in terms of us being a parliamentary democracy, we have a parliament. We have a bicameral legislative branch, bicameral in the sense that it's divided amongst two chambers. On one hand, the upper house, the Senate, which is appointed representatives from across Canada who review and provide regional perspectives on Canadian legislation. And on the other side, the lower house, the House of Commons. And this is, I think, what we'll be focusing on today with our conversation. The House of Commons consists of members of Parliament. Members of Parliament are elected civilian Canadian officials who run in Canadian ridings. A riding is an electoral or a federal electoral district. And every election, every riding will have a vote to determine which candidate running in that riding will be the member of Parliament. So going and returning to the original question of how does Canada's electoral system operate? Mm-hmm. We have within Canada, since Confederation, used a first past the post system, a plurality system to determine our elected officials. What that means is that all Canadians, in order to vote in the Canadian election, there's three criteria in which you must support. You must have a residence within Canada. you must be a Canadian citizen, you must be above the age of 18. Within the Canadian Constitution, there are considerations for other Canadians outside of these criteria, or peoples outside of these criteria. But for the purpose of our conversation today, that's what it means to be a Canadian voter. If you match those criteria, you have one vote, whereby on polling day, you will head to your local riding's polling station operated by Elections Canada. And so Elections Canada is actually also a unique organization in terms of the electoral system. Elections Canada is a fully independent, non-partisan organization whose mandate is to ensure the fairness and transparency of Canadian elections. So you will have your vote, you will go to your local polling station, and you will vote amongst several candidates who are listed to be running in your riding. After your vote is cast, Elections Canada will take the boxes, and in addition to be, an interesting fact of being the most employed organization on election day in Canada, it employs over 400,000 people during election day. The ballots will be counted manually and recounted, and an announcement will be provided as soon as the results are known. What happens at that point? The leader, well, first off, you as a individual in a riding, you are voting for your member of parliament. You will have decided who your member of parliament is. In a first past the post system, why a first past the post system sort of works in Canada. Basically, whoever gets the majority of the votes within a riding is elected that riding's member of parliament. And that's interesting to note, because that doesn't often mean that a candidate who has won a position or seat as a member of parliament is actually holding the popular vote, right? Like, you can have many different candidates running in an election. In fact, in this upcoming election, one of our ballots has 91 candidates. So there's certain cases where, the popular vote may be distributed elsewhere, but that's besides the point. The point is, with the first past the post system, whoever has the most votes at the end of count is the individual who assumes the seat.
Selected. Yeah.
Exactly. And so after this has occurred, we will also know who the winning party is. So typically, with the candidates are run in these ridings are from political parties, which we'll discuss a little bit later. The party that wins the majority of seats in the House is said to create government, or has the prerogative to create government. If they win the majority of seats in the House of Commons, they are said to have a majority government. If they win most of the seats in the House of Commons, but not a majority of seats, so the House of Commons has 343 seats. If they don't win more than 50 plus one of those seats, they're said to have a minority government, which has its own sort of governing challenges and considerations. But basically, at the end of the night, the winning party will be announced based on the number of seats that have been won across Canada. The leader of that political party will becomes the prime minister designate, and subsequently, in the days following the election, will meet the Governor General of Canada to ask the Governor General to form government at an agreed upon date, and to set up, we don't really call it an inauguration ceremony, but a swearing in ceremony, where the Prime Minister is formally invested with the executive authority of the Crown to form government and to enact the policies and laws of Canada. Now, as I mentioned earlier, with the Canadian Constitution and other Canadian legislation and rules of procedure, this is primarily parliamentary convention. It's not required, but it is a matter of practice that the Prime Minister does this, that he goes and he meets with the Governor General, because again, the Governor General and the Crown in not only within the Constitution, but in parliamentary practice, is the one responsible for selecting the prime minister. That's seen in terms of practice as the Canadian people have elected this particular party, they have elected this particular party, and their leader, therefore, should be the governor and council, including his cabinet. Once the Crown approves the Prime Minister and cabinet ministers are sworn into something called the King's Privy Council. This is in all effects, the executive branch, because again, in Canada, we're not a presidential system. We don't have a president. We have a prime minister and appointed ministers who discuss policies and debate them within the House of Commons to enact them into laws. And I guess lastly, maybe a point to kind of close off on, typically, and this has varied in terms of that, after we know who the prime minister is going to be at the end of next Monday, we still will have to wait until government is formed. And government will be formed when the prime minister chooses to approach Parliament, to reopen Parliament, and to introduce the Governor General to provide the speech from the throne. The speech from the throne is again a parliamentary process, but it's a parliamentary process where the Governor General outlines the objectives and the goals of the Prime Minister and his or her government. And with this, Parliament will start again until the next election.
Great. It sounds a very interesting process. Just to remind those who are watching or listening to this podcast, this is Globedades, a podcast from the Faculty of Global Studies at Universidad Anáhuac, Mexico. My name is Arturo Flores, and today we are talking about Canadian elections, which are coming soon, with Dr. Kiernan McClelland. So some people are wondering, why are we having a snap election in April when apparently the election should have taken place a bit further, in time. Why is this happening now?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, because by law, so as described in the Canadian Constitution, the maximum time between federal elections in Canada it's required to be 5 years, and held after the fourth year of that year that a new government is formed on the third Monday of October. So that is required under Canadian law. So there is a set election date. However, there are certain powers and situations where a early election can be held or can be called. So for example, the Governor General in their capacity as the representative of the Crown, of the sovereign, may accept advice from the King or Queen's Privy Council, i.e. the Prime Minister and their cabinet, to dissolve Parliament, or accept the resignation of a Prime Minister after a government is defeated within the legislative branch, or the lower house of the legislative branch, the House of Commons, through something called a confidence motion. A confidence motion is an interesting aspect, because a confidence motion, like many things in the Canadian parliamentary system, there really isn't a clear definition of what constitutes a confidence motion. A confidence motion, for example, can be a vote on a major government supply bill. The Canadian government, the executive, must provide a national budget for Canada, which outlines expenditures of government funds, taxes, programs, etc. This must be pushed because we must, use that cash to support the Canadian public. If that budget is not accepted, then that is considered a confidence motion, leading to a confidence vote. Confidence motions can also be enacted for other things. For example, confidence motions in the past for previous governments, the government of, for example, Prime Minister Stephen Harper in the 2000s, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker in the 1960s. A confidence motion can be held if Parliament finds someone is in contempt of Parliament, i.e. they've decided to close Parliament, to keep it closed purposefully, although that is a very rare sort of occurrence. What has happened this year is the first option. Prime Minister or Mark Carney exercised this first option after having promised to call an election after becoming the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada and subsequently becoming the new Prime Minister of Canada. Because in the sequence of events here, and returning to my description of kind of the Canadian electoral system, Canadians do not vote for the Prime Minister. We're not a Republican system where we will vote for a president to represent us. We are a parliamentary democracy, meaning that we vote for the party. With the resignation of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, a leadership convention was held by the Liberal Party. The registered Liberal Party members were given the right to elect their leader, and that leader was Prime Minister Mark Carney. And so, because Canadians are not voting for the Prime Minister, but rather they are voting for the party, and because the party, the Liberal Party, was the one that had won the last election, they were still, basically the democratic legitimacy is extended from Justin Trudeau to Mark Carney. However, Mark Carney was able to sort of, exercise the first option in order to legitimize that democratic legitimacy, right? And this was an election promise of his as well, as he was being tapped for leadership amongst the Liberal Party. So that's kind of where we're at right now. Snap election has been held for next week, April 28th, full couple months or so after it was announced, and we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, sounds a the process that how you described it. I think it's very interesting, and it's not very common to see this, especially in the Latin American context, which we are more about the presidential figure, and we have this representative democracy where we elect someone, and the fact that you vote for a party which is going to constitute this majority and then form a government, it's quite interesting how you mention it. So
actually, sorry, I'll throw in an added thing there. It's a cool little exercise to think of. Although this has never happened, it could happen. It is fully within the scale of the Canadian Constitution that this could happen, because the Prime Minister is A, a civilian, and B, is a elected individual from the party. There is a possibility that during an election or an election period, that the leader of a party could potentially change. So either the Prime Minister or Prime Minister designate or official opposition leader designate could potentially change halfway through. It just needs to be based on the decision of the party members to decide that. And again, like that, in terms of first past the post system, in terms of Canadian parliamentary representation, that is in many ways sort of besides the point, because you're not voting for those individuals. You're voting for your own member of parliament to be representing your riding from a political party within the House of Commons. So again, it's very like political parties in Canada are fascinating because they are very fluid. And not only that, but as we've seen with Prime Minister Trudeau and Prime Minister Carney, business continues as usual. And, business continues as usual, and things kind of there really isn't there's a designated period in order to determine potential candidates for party leadership. But the sort of tempo in which Canadian parties continue to operate or the government operate, it continues to work, or it continues to operate in this way. And it goes to actually the saying in Canada, which we like to put out about the Canadian political system, peace, order, and good government, right? So long as everything is going smoothly, great. You know, and so that's why, especially when that news came down of Prime Minister Trudeau resigning, and we were hearing not only was Canadian politics suddenly international news, which is great for us. It's a great way to kind of get us involved, but it also was interesting in the sense that people would ask us, well, how could Canada elect or how could Canada make its prime minister an unelected official? And the answer to that is because Canada, it's entrenched within the Constitution that you're able to, the political party is able to decide its leader. And if it's able to decide its leader, it's able to, and if that party has, again, gained legitimacy through an election where it holds the most number of seats, that's a legitimate process. And so did Carney, and this is the main kind of counterfactual of the situation that I kind of wanted to loop back to, was could Carney have become the prime minister and then remained in the prime minister position until the 3rd October in 3 years' time? Yes, absolutely. He had every right to do so. However, in Canada, and especially when it comes to that, peace, order, and good government, his decision was instead to make good on his promise and call the election early, just to get the legitimacy. So again, I think it's a perfect example of a proper sort of transition of power, as well as how cordial the Canadian political system can be. Everybody likes to, Canadians are known for following rules. We love following rules. And we love putting our money where our mouth is, and we love following rules. So it's a interesting and a very demonstrative case study into again how the Canadian system runs.
Yeah, well, just a reminder to the people who are watching or listening to us, this is Globedades, a podcast from the Faculty of Global Studies at Universidad Anáhuac, Mexico. My name is Arturo Flores, and today we're talking about the Canadian election with Dr. Kieran McClelland. And the next question I would like to ask you is about, you already mentioned the parties which are involved, but who are the main parties and leaders contesting in this election?
Mm-hmm. So typically in this election and in other elections, there are 3 so-called traditional federal parties and 2 additional political parties who have remained fixtures within the Canadian Parliament since the 90s, who have currently seats in the House of Commons. The first that I mentioned earlier is the Liberal Party of Canada. The Liberal Party has been in power since 2015, when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was voted in. At the dissolution of Parliament a few months ago, it had 153 seats. And in general, the Liberal Party sits to the center to about center left in the Canadian political system. It is very much a moderate party. In addition, the Liberal Party is really the longest serving and oldest active federal political party within the country, leading to the epithet that is used by some people of it being the natural governing party of Canada. And so now this party is being led by Prime Minister Mark Carney. On the other side, we have the Conservative Party of Canada. It is the official opposition for Canada, with Pierre Poilievre as the leader, the official leader of the official opposition, of His Majesty's official opposition, and they currently have 120 seats. The Conservative Party in its current iteration in Canada is interesting because it's actually a recent party. It was formed in 2003 through a merger of the old Progressive Conservative Party, the party that actually founded Canada in 1867, and a group called the Canadian Alliance, which was a regional party dedicated towards Western Canadian interests. It sits center right to right on the Canadian political spectrum, maybe a little bit more right in this election with its proposed promises on things like government spending and immigration. However, it also remains one of sort of the two natural governing parties. In fact, the Liberal Party and the Conservative parties are the only two parties in the history of Canada that have ever won an election. On the other side of the traditional federal parties, you have the New Democratic Party of Canada. This is Canada's Social Democratic Party, which sits center left on the Canadian political spectrum. Its leader is Jagmeet Singh, and on one hand, while it has placed third in Canada in the last election for the popular vote, and remember, we're going back to the challenges of the first past the post system. So even though the NDP have received, below the Conservatives and Liberals in terms of the popular vote, but a sizable percentage of the popular vote, they do not have the third most number of seats within the House of Commons. Pardon me, they only have 24 seats. The honor of the third leading party in the House of Commons goes to the Bloc Québécois. Now, the Bloc Québécois is yet another center-left party. However, this one is much more focused on regional interests, particularly a focus on Quebec nationalism and the promotion of Québécois sovereignty. It notably only runs candidates in Quebec, in order to sort of support this sovereigntist agenda. And its current leader pardon me, is Yves-François Blanchet. And at last count, I think it had about, it had 33 seats within the House of Commons. And last but not least, we have the Green Party of Canada. Now, the Green Party is an interesting aspect of the Canadian political system. It is yet again another center-left party. However, the Greens were founded in the 1980s on a very strong ecological policy, focusing on eco-politics and really pushing a pro-environmentalist agenda within the federal government of Canada. Its strongest support has actually been in BC, in British Columbia, with its main sort of advocate and leader over the years being Elizabeth May, who has really sort of been the sole voice of the Green Party within the House of Commons. However, this election is interesting because Elizabeth May has, I don't think retired, but has taken a step back from that sort of leadership role. And the current leader of the Green Party is the second ever Green Party seat, Jonathan Pinot. So that's an overview of the current parties that exist, or that are competitively viable, I would say, for this upcoming election. There are a few others that have never won seats. For example, the right to far right People's Party of Canada is a group that is founded from members of the Canadian Alliance and Conservative Party, a much more Republican-focused, like very strong conservative minded party. However, this party is very new. It was founded in the 2010s and has only really existed in one election where it didn't win any seats. And as we'll talk about later, the current projection is that it will not receive seats as well. But parties can exist. A number of parties run in federal elections in Canada. There are other groups like the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada, to a joke party called the Rhinoceros Party that just kind of does whatever they so choose, right? They, things, for example, like running, the ads for every single Canadian should be entitled to 6 beavers every single year, like joke policies like that.
Okay.
And of course, again, these parties have never won seats or have never been competitively viable.
Okay, just a reminder to all of those who are listening or watching this podcast. This is Globedades, a podcast from the Faculty of Global Studies at Universidad Anáhuac, Mexico. My name is Arturo Flores, and today we're talking about the Canadian election with Dr. Kieran McClelland. So, what would you say are the key issues influencing voters these days in this election that we're having soon?
So, it's interesting that you bring up this question now, because yesterday the official party platforms were released with the policies, and I had a little bit of time to kind of go over them. But from discussing, from hearing what commentators have to say, discussing with other Canadians, a few of the dominant issues that are really focusing this election includes the cost of living, it includes the economy, and it includes housing affordability. Those are some of the sort of main elements that are being discussed, in addition to other issues that have been fixtures in Canadian elections since time immemorial. Everything from the creation of jobs to infrastructure, Indigenous relations, taxes, guns, healthcare. However, I think for voters, the most important issue for this election is Canada's relationship with the United States and its response to tariffs. That seems to be the main topic, which is that is a concern of Canadians. Yeah.
Welcome to our world.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, right? Mexico, same amount, right?
Exactly.
Again, like as you recall, right? Like Trump implemented 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. I believe he did a similar amount with Mexico at one point.
Yes, because we're proud of that as well.
Yeah. Well, so here's the thing, right? Hashtag elbows up. But 25% of tariffs on Canadian goods, on global tariffs related to steel, aluminum, and cars, to which Canada is the largest exporter for the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, like these are tariffs that are placed on goods with the clarity that we've received over current weeks, with the exception of products kind of covered under UMESCA, right? So fine. But then, of course, there's also the elephant in the room that has been communicated over recent months, which is that Trump has spoken publicly about Canada becoming the 51st state of the United States.
I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's had that's had a bit of an impact. The relationship between the U.S. and Canada is one which is unique, or I should say was unique in the world. One of the largest unprotected borders, the largest unprotected border in the world, incredibly strong cultural and obviously linguistic connections. So obviously the sudden threat of territorial annexation didn't really go over well, even if it was considered a joke. And we've seen this time and time again being communicated by Canadian civil society and commentators. In terms of the election, though, and in terms of election promises that the parties have provided, the major parties, so the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, New Democrat, and Bloc Québécois, have all promised in different degrees domestic relief programs for targeted industries. So the Liberal Party is looking at, for example, more reciprocal tariffs. They've committed to be a little bit more strategic, of focusing on industries that are more, would have a better impact on disrupting the U.S. than others, and they're going to target reciprocal tariffs for those areas. Because again, we didn't we didn't start this, but we'll fight if we need to. Whereas the Conservative Party has sort of pushed forward more policies geared towards renegotiation. And I should say the Liberals are also discussing renegotiation, but really policies that are more focused on protecting Canadians. So more inward looking than outward looking, I would say in this case. And I don't know, I think in a way this kind of speaks to the perception that Canadians have that may influence their decision in this election, right? The exward looking view versus the inward looking view, especially vis-a-vis the US. On one hand, the Liberal Party is really advocating for greater diversification amongst a greater number of partners. So not just traditional partners in Europe, but elsewhere in the world. Whereas the Conservative Party seems to be sort of focusing on more strategic partnerships with existing members outside of the US. So countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, for example. I know like one of the most interesting things I read in the Conservative platform that kind of made me turn my head was a commitment to pursue a free trade and mobility agreement between the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And so this idea of CANZUK has actually existed in Canada for a very long time. But for whatever reason, the Canadian government has, from both sides, from both Conservative and Liberal governments that have preceded this one, have never really wanted to pursue that plan. So it's interesting to see it mentioned in the party platform, but it's also indicative of where that party is looking towards its interest. Maybe just like a personal point to mention, personally speaking, I think with this election, like really, when we talk about Canadian partnerships and Canadian engagement with the US, on one hand, diversification is absolutely key. Canada, funny enough, is one of the only countries in the world. I think we are one of the countries in the world where we are included as a member of the most international and regional organizations. Everything from like Le Francophonie to the European Space Agency. We are members of that. So diversification is not outside of the Canadian identity, and certainly a political tactic in terms of, especially in times of heightened stress with our southern neighbor. On the other hand, I don't see a situation where the relationship with the US and the partnerships that have been established over the last 100 years are in any way, disrupted beyond repair. The reality is different, sure, but at the same time, we need to contend with the very established relationship that we have developed with the United States and move with it. So I don't see, the response I at least see and what I see from Canadians, on one hand, it isn't a black and white issue. But certainly in this election, I think Canadians are really focusing on whether or not they want how do they see a strong Canada? Do they see a strong Canada on the international stage as being one that makes more friends and is diversifying and going around and establishing more connections and partnerships? Or do they see it as one where it's focusing on its people first and really ensuring that we're strong at home before we step foot in the foreign stage? And again, I think only time will see what voters decide next Monday.
Now, the toughest question.
Okay.
For you.
Yeah.
What are the prospects for each party in this election, which is like your forecast? So what do you expect?
So honestly, Arturo, it is really hard to say who's going to win this election, especially between the Liberals and the Conservatives. I mean, like when pardon me, when Prime Minister Trudeau resigned at the beginning of 2025, national polling averages, as conducted by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, had the Liberal Party drop to, I think it was like 20% support from Canadians, 20% or 21% support for the Liberals versus a 40% support in favor for the Conservative Party, 40 or 45%. Now, some commentators were describing this as the great Liberal blowout, this election, whereby the Conservatives would win hands down. The Liberal Party had been for 3 years now suffering from declining polling numbers, and the writing was on the wall. And yet, for a number of reasons, internal, domestic, and international, and since Carney became prime minister, the national average polling numbers have actually ticked up at a staggering rate. And I think I checked this morning, according to the CBC, we now have virtually a 40% approval rate for the Liberal Party with just under 40 support for the Conservatives. So we're basically neck and neck between those two parties. Now, in terms of probabilities of who are going to win, again, taking polls with a grain of salt, everything can change on election day, but the current probability has about 77% chance of the Liberals winning a majority government. And think about that for a second, right? So that's a majority government. That is half of 343 seats at a time when 3 years ago they were polling 20% of Canadians wanting to support them. That is staggering. So 70% majority government. I think it was a 16% chance of a minority government for the Liberals being elected, with the Conservatives being a 5% chance of the Conservatives winning a majority and a 1% chance of them winning a minority. The point of the matter is, like, we'll have to see, right? We can really only wait until election day on Monday to see what the final outcome is, because we're neck and neck right now. And, you know, I would say to anybody listening, if there's an interest to follow the Canadian elections, the two sort of key provinces that you should be paying attention to in this election would be Quebec. Mentioning before that, again, the Bloc Québécois are running in Quebec, and they always run in Quebec. And the majority of their seats are won in Quebec. So the question is whether or not the Bloc Québécois will lose seats this election. Again, CBC is projecting that they will, staggeringly, to the Liberal Party. And Ontario. How does Ontario go? Will New Democratic Party seats that were won in urban areas suddenly flip Liberal? Whether or not because people are voting strategically, or you know, they see dissatisfaction with the NDP. So those are, I think, the two provinces to focus on. But for now, Arturo, I mean, we'll have to see. I'm crossing my finger. It'll be interesting. I think that'll be the main thing to take away from this. Is it's going to be a very interesting election. And again, it's been a fun ride to follow it, because internationally, and again, especially here in Mexico, I found there's been such a sudden interest in Canada and in Canadian politics, which, you know, obviously with Mexico and Canada sharing a continent with the United States, you know, U.S. political system tends to take a very pronounced sort of role in the public zeitgeist as well. So it's nice to have a situation where Mexico is interested in Canada, and Mexicans are interested in Canadian politics.
Yeah, great. Well, I want to thank you for your time, and I am sure this is not going to be the last time that we have you as a guest in this podcast. And let's hope for the best result to, you know, come out after this Canadian election, which we are going to follow, of course, with interest. As you said, we share the same region, and I think it's a very interesting time that we are having now with the way the U.S. has been dealing with with both countries, Canada and Mexico, as neighbors. So
Mhm.
let's see how things go. And thank you again for your time.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, this is Globedades. Today we spoke about the Canadian election with our guest, Dr. Kieran McClelland. And we hope to see you in the next emission of Globedades, this podcast from the Faculty of Global Studies at Universidad Anáhuac, Mexico. My name is Arturo Flores, and see